So here's a question for you. Cannibalism. At what level of self-preservation would you need to be pushed, you personally, in order to commit an act deemed so dark in the realm of humanity that so few people outside of tribal law are believed to have engaged in it? Do you even think that you could ever engage in such an activity? Today's story is about a group of people thrust into such a situation. Stick around to see if they would actually be driven to commit this seemingly dark and tribal act. Welcome to the flip side, folks. If you like tales from the more obscure chapters of humanity, then you've come to the right place, as that's what I do. I recount stories of true crimes, cold cases, paranormal events, and just obscure cases from history that may be overlooked. So please sit back and relax as we delve into an event that went on to become known as a benchmark case in the lengths to what some people would do in order to survive. Now, this is the story of the ill-fated Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 in an event that most people refer to as the 1972 Andes air disaster. Now, on October 12, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 taxied on the apron of the Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo, Uruguay, destined for Santiago, Chile. Among the 45 passengers, 22-year-old Nando Parado, a member of the Old Christians Club rugby team, was looking forward to the exhibition game that they were setting off to play. The remaining passengers were his teammates, along with members of his and their families, as well as a spattering of a few friends. Now, outside of the rugby team members and their supporters, an aircrew of 5 personnel accounted for the remaining passengers on the aircraft. Now, as Nando arranged his seatbelt, neither he nor anyone aboard that fateful flight could ever imagined what was waiting in store for them. Climbing to a cruising altitude, it soon became apparent that the weather conditions were going to be anything but smooth, and as the aircraft responded to being increasingly buffeted by turbulence, Nando knew, of course, that even on good days, it was common for flights in this particular region to experience extreme weather. The pilots, on seeing worsening weather on their radars, made the decision to detour and stop overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. Now, by the following morning, it seemed that the conditions had barely changed and forced the flight to be stalled yet again. Now, with all the delays accounted for, the pilots eventually steered their aircraft away from the departure terminal at 2:18 p.m. on, of all days, Friday the 13th, October 1972. Picking up speed for takeoff, the aircraft, a Fairchild FH-227D, was piloted by Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas and co-piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dante Laguarara. They had just set in motion one of the craziest survival stories in modern commercial aviation history. Now, the plane's route planned for a flight through the Andes at an altitude of just a little over 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet. And as expected, the aircraft experienced turbulence and low visibility due to the clouds. Now, the planned route, however, was not a direct one, given that the operating ceiling for that particular airframe wouldn't allow it to pass some of the more mountainous peaks within the mountain range between the point of departure and their destination. Now, throughout the flight, the aircraft was buffeted by violent turbulence and dipped violently in air pockets from time to time. Showing bravado, some of the team members, Nando included, would whoop and holler when the turbulence was at its worst. Pilot Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas had flown similar routes on numerous occasions through these mountain ranges. He was a highly respected and accomplished pilot, and he had a wealth of experience in such conditions. But on this fateful day, however, Faraday had entrusted the airplane to the lesser experienced co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Laguarara. Now, the situation was dire. Flying instrument only conditions, meaning all they could see out of the windows was cloud and mist. So they had to rely on their navigational equipment 100%, and that was programmed to a scheduled route on the onboard computer. Now, after having passed the Argentinian town of Curicó, the pilots believed they had successfully crossed the Andes and begun their descent towards Santiago. However, they had miscalculated their position, and just as they were clearing a segment of thick cloud, their low altitude warning systems started to sound. The aircraft had not yet cleared the mountains, and by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. At around 3:30 p.m, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 collided with a mountain peak at some 4,000 meters altitude. The plane's right wing clipped the mountain and severed from the fuselage. And shortly after, the left wing and the tail section were also torn off. The fuselage then slid a further 340 meters down the mountain, eventually coming to rest in a snow-covered valley. Of the 45 people on board, 12 unfortunately were killed instantly on impact. Many of the survivors were in pretty bad shape. Nando himself was unconscious for the first 3 days after the crash. Now, he was also travelling with his mother and his sister, who would both regularly join him to offer their moral support. Tragically for Nando, his mother, Eugene Parado, died instantly on impact, and his younger sister, Susana Parado, was gravely injured. Unfortunately, Susana eventually succumbed to her injuries some 8 days after the crash, and even more tragically, she died in Nando's arms. Now, stranded at some 3,600 metres or 11,800 feet, the survivors were unaware that the search party for them had been in full swing since the day after they disappeared. Realising that the aircraft, which was predominantly white in colour, would have been practically invisible from the air, those who remained alive at this point soon started to understand that they were stuck, alone and without much hope of rescue. Having occurred in one of the most remote areas of the Andes, and despite extensive search efforts, rescue teams were unable to locate the wreckage of the aeroplane, and after several days of fruitless searching, authorities assumed that there were no survivors and called the search off. Now, salvaging whatever supplies they could get from the wreckage, the survivors took stock of their meagre supplies. These included a few bottles of wine and some chocolate bars, items that quickly ran out. Now, the lack of food became the most pressing issue as the days dragged on, and with no signs of rescue, they began to face the terrible reality that they may very well starve to death on this mountain. Even though he'd suffered massive personal loss with the passing of both his mother and his sister in the disaster, Nando Pereiro went on to become one of the pivotal survivors of this tragedy. And sadly for them, Mother Nature wasn't quite done with them yet. On October 29th, just over 2 weeks after the crash, tragedy struck once again. An avalanche hit the wreckage, killing a further 8 survivors who had been sheltering within the fuselage. Among the dead were some of the people who'd taken leadership roles in organising the efforts to date, and one of these was the co-pilot La Guerrara. Now, his friend and lead pilot Ferradas hadn't fared so well, being amongst those who died at the time of impact when the plane initially hit the mountain. Now, just 19 people remained alive, and with even fewer resources. And so their ordeal began. Those optimistic amongst the survivors quickly realised that if they were to survive for the long haul, they would have to buckle down and be incredibly resourceful with regards to rationing what it is they had left. Now, at times, this would mean that all they would have in any 24-hour period was just a sliver of chocolate and as much melted snow as they could take, far too little to sustain their ever-weakening bodies. Now, faced with the imminent threat of starvation, the survivors made a desperate and unthinkable decision. They would eat the bodies of those who had died in the crash. They justified the act as a necessity for their survival, and many compared it to the Christian act of communion, believing that by consuming their deceased friends, they would stay alive in order to be able to tell the world their story. Now, this was not a decision that was taken lightly, requiring deep contemplation by all survivors. But in the cold reality of their situation, all of those present understood the human meat to be the only source of protein and sustenance available to them, and that without it, they would certainly face death. Now, the bodies were preserved by the cold temperatures, but the process of overcoming the psychological barrier of cannibalism was difficult for many of the survivors. Now, over time, however, hunger overcame their revulsion, and they began to consume the flesh of the deceased, accepting the act as a matter of survival rather than a choice. Doing so also allowed them to continue holding out for a chance of being rescued. Now, almost a month had passed, and by mid-November, it was pretty apparent to the remaining survivors if they were to have any chance of getting out of their predicament, they themselves, or an appointed small detail of them, would have to be the ones to walk out in the hope of finding civilization and raising the alarm. Now, of the remaining group, a trio who appeared to be in the best physical condition, given their circumstances, volunteered to make that trek. And on December the 12th, 1972, after a couple of weeks of preparation and with the cold gnawing at their bodies, Roberto Canessa, Antonio Vizintin and Nando Parado set off from the crash site. They took some small rations of food and materials that they could use for warmth, and after a couple of days of grueling climbing, Nando and Roberto soon realised that Vizintin would not make it, and he was duly sent back to the crash site after giving them some of his rations for the trek in order to give them a better chance of getting out. Now, in heightened states of physiological weakness due to the ordeal of the expedition to seek help, it pushed both Roberto and Nando to their absolute limits. Days turned into night as the two men battled the elements, fatigue, and the mental strain of their predicament. They decided to head west, believing that their best option of finding the closest human presence would be in Chile. And so they leaned into the bad weather that battered their already weakened bodies and continued onward. Now, Parado and Canessa continued west, trekking for another week or so through the nightmarish conditions, until eventually on December 20th, they spotted a Chilean shepherd by the name of Sergio Catalan. Now, he was, however, on the other side of a river, and unable to communicate clearly due to the distance and the noise of the roaring water, they ended up wrapping a note around a stone and they threw that to Catalan. And that on that note, it explained who they were, that they were asking for help and what they wanted. Now, given that he was aware of the accident and of course the local weather conditions, Catalan was amazed that anyone could have survived that long in those mountainous conditions, let alone walk out themselves over multiple days with limited food, weather and protective equipment. Needless to say, he quickly alerted authorities and a massive rescue effort was immediately set in motion. Now, on December the 22nd, 1972, some 72 days after having been stranded in the Andean mountains, helicopters and other emergency services arrived at the crash site and started rescuing the remaining 14 survivors. Now, Nando and Canessa were already being taken care of. They were taken to hospital in Santiago and treated for malnutrition, dehydration and injuries sustained during the crash, and of course the avalanche. The story of their ordeal quickly made headlines around the world. While the act of cannibalism shocked many, the public largely sympathised with the survivors, recognising that they had broken one of the ultimate human taboos to stay alive. The 16 survivors eventually returned to Uruguay, where they were heralded as heroes. Although many of them initially struggled with the trauma of their experience for many years after their return, they soon got on with their lives. Some, as in the case of Nando, went on to have very profitable and positive life experiences. Many of them also went on to become after-dinner speakers, giving their own respective accounts of the tragedy and how they dealt with it. Above all, they were open about their cannibalism, explaining and accepting it as a necessity, a necessary act to survive. The story of the crash and their harrowing journey was immortalised in the 1974 book Alive by Piers Paul Reed, which in 1993 was also adapted into a successful film of the same name. Now, the crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 remains as one of the most remarkable survival stories of all time, stories of human resilience and endurance that highlighted the extraordinary lengths that people will go to when faced with the ultimate struggle for life. So there you have it, folks, an incredible tale of survival overcoming mental hurdles, especially when dealing with the harrowing act that remains one of the taboos associated with human behaviour. Now, I guess nobody can really understand that dilemma until they themselves have been in the same predicament. But what a horrible situation to be in, knowing that the only way to survive would be to eat the remains of people that you'd once seen as friends, people that maybe you'd played soccer with or just enjoyed a sport so much that it united you as a group of friends. Now, on another point, the channel name. It seems people have cast their vote, and I'll be looking to start the process of changing the name in due course. Now, as you may or may not have seen the poll in the community segment down below, we set up a poll and the name that resonates with most people is The Chronicles of the Obscure. And so be it. I'll start making that change over the coming weeks. But until then, I'd like to wish you all the best. Please do stay safe, stay happy and healthy, and above all, stay sane. And until next time, this is me wishing you all the best. Cheers.